This is your Daily 5 for Tuesday, November 4th, 2025. While I was down in LA for Adobe Max last week, I chose in the middle of a wonderfully uplifting and creatively empowering summit where there were lots of people who were just wonderful to be around and had a great deal of creative energy. I decided that was the perfect venue to watch 2025's The Long Walk, which is an adaptation of a Stephen King story under the pseudonym of Richard Bachman from 1979. Now, this is a story I'm very familiar with. I've read the Bachman books, and in particular, The Long Walk, several times. And so I knew going into this movie that unless there was a radical change, that it was a bleak and depressing story that likely would not leave me feeling all that great at the end. But since I am so familiar with The Long Walk, I think it's probably my favorite of the Bachman stories, to be honest. I wanted to see it because I had read that it was really well made and that, yes, it was bleak and depressing. And so I went into it with the knowledge of what the story was and where it would likely end up. And by the end, it ended up, when I got to the end of the film, I would confidently say that it's one of the best made films that I would recommend almost nobody watch, because it is bleak and hopeless and depressing. So just understand that going in. Now, I'm not going to spoil much if you're not familiar with the story, but if you've read The Long Walk, the Bachman story, then you will know most of, if not 98% of what's going to happen in the story. And in fact, I don't really think... Now look, let's start with this. If you're a purist, don't bother watching this. I would tell anybody who's a purist about any book or a story that's adapted, don't bother. You're just going to end up being very irritated by the changes. Even though I think that in the case of The Long Walk, there really isn't all that much that I feel like got changed. I think that the core of the story is fundamentally the same. But again, I've seen people complaining about changes from the book. Then don't watch it. Just don't watch it. If you cannot accept any transmutation of something into a different format because it makes sense or there's some artist interpretation involved, don't bother. You're just going to end up getting irritated and you're going to stop anyway. But I also would tell almost anybody else not to watch this because it is really gut-wrenchingly depressing when you get to the end of it. It is, and there's just no disguising that. Now, without spoiling anything, the basic setup, and this is laid out right at the beginning, and this is the same for the book as it is to the movie in the broad strokes of it, is in some future. Now, in the future, I say, because in the book, I think it was supposed to be some type of couple years off. It feels like the movie also is grounded in the 70s, just by the model of the cars and the lack of modern technology. It sure feels like it is supposed to be still in the mid to late 70s. But at some point, there was a war. And after the war, the United States ended up in a really bad state economically. And so there is a contest held where a representative of every state, so 50 states, now in the book it's 100, in the movie it's 50, is brought together to go on the Long Walk. And the Long Walk is literally what it sounds like. You simply walk, maintaining a minimum speed of 3 miles an hour. There are strikes that can be issued, and if you get 3 strikes, the next time you are eliminated from the contest. And you know exactly what that means if you've seen the trailer. So the basic way a movie like this will work is if you establish a set of characters that we feel attached to, because we know they can't all make it to the end. And so what makes the movie impactful is if you feel something for these characters. And I think in that way, the movie absolutely excels. Now, I've seen criticism saying, well, there's a lot of characters that are in the background. And so, when they're eliminated, you don't really feel anything. Well, no kidding. Trying to make 50 characters all feel equally weighty to a viewer is something I don't know that you could do outside of a miniseries. And I don't know that this thing could be sustained for a miniseries because people would simply become too depressed and stop watching. So that criticism is invalid. Again, changes from the book, I don't care. The core of the story is there. And it is a magnificently well done film. The problem is you gotta know going into this that this is not meant to give you a warm and fuzzy feeling at the end. Now, some people are going to be okay with that. And if that's the case, then I think you're going to have a really good time. But if you don't want to watch that, and I normally don't, but again, I was so familiar with this story, and I find it to be such an interesting Stephen King story because there's no supernatural element. It's very simple. It's very direct. It relies on characterization. And so I was curious how well it could be adapted because a lot of people said it would be impossible. And actually, it's done very well. So it's a beautifully done movie. But again, unless you're ready for what it's going to deliver, I wouldn't recommend it because it's just too bleak. Later.